Well, good evening. Thank you very much for being here. I'm sure that you're all aware that Hugo Chavez is is a figure who arouses very strong emotions, and I think few acts of Hugo Chavez have aroused such deep division amongst journalists, amongst Venezuelans around the world, as the decision not to renew the license of Radio Caracas TV, which was Venezuela's oldest and most popular television station. When Hugo Chavez refused to renew the license, the most popularly quoted reason abroad was that it had been a supporter of the brief and failed coup attempt back at the beginning of Chavez's administration. Hugo himself also accused it of pornography, of running rather steamy soap operas, in bias, inaccuracy, of many things. Whether or not these were sufficient grounds effectively to close it down remains a highly contentious issue. Was it an act of tyranny? Was it a suppression of freedom of information that all journalists should oppose? According to the Venezuelan journalist trade union, it was to be opposed. They were very against it, and they talk of a climate of aggression and threats against journalists in Venezuela. Here in Britain, Jeremy Dear, who's the Secretary General of the NUJ, supported Chavez wholeheartedly, accused the media of manipulation and lies, and promised a pan-European campaign in support and in defense of Chavez. It's an argument that was reflected in the letters columns of The Guardian, where one letter with an eminent list of signatories was in support, precipitated a response from a group of Venezuelan writers and artists in outrage. So tonight we're here to discuss it, and we're joined by a very strong and knowledgeable panel. On my left is Yolanda Valady, who is a producer for the Latin American section on the BBC World Service, and formerly a journalist for Radio Caracas Radio and for El Universal Television. Yes, ma'am. Peter Newland is the senior legal officer of Article 19. Jonathan Rugman is diplomatic correspondent for Channel 4 News, and Richard Gott, who'll be known to many of you, is a former Latin American correspondent and features editor for The Guardian, and author of many books on Latin America and indeed on Venezuela. So the format tonight, we'll just ask each of our contributors just to lay out what they think of this issue and why, quite briefly. We'll have a session of discussion up here, and we'll open it to the floor very quickly, so we'll all get a chance to join in. So perhaps, would you care to start and tell us what you think? Was it right to close down this television station?
Well, I represent an organisation here that works to promote and protect freedom of expression in countries around the world, and it probably won't come as a surprise to you that we regard Chavez's act as basically censorship. The reason for that is very simple. A definition of censorship is interference by executive organs, by the government, directly in media affairs, and that is what this was. This was Chavez directly taking action to shut down or to decide not to renew the license of a television station for reasons related to the content of what they were putting on air. Although the exact reasons why it was shut down is, as you just said, Isabella, not entirely clear, but it is very clear that it is content related. So that would be my first point. The second sort of more general point that I think this leads to is is actually an underlying problem which isn't related to Chavez at all, but which is related to the system of media regulation that you find in Venezuela and in many other countries. And that is as follows. If you have any legislation that allows the president this kind of direct interference in media regulation, that is going to be a recipe for disaster. And we've seen problems like this at Article 19, not just in Venezuela, but in countries around the world. And so our sort of recipe for change here would be, first of all, you know, to withdraw Chavez's sort of direct interference in media affairs and make sure that he's not going to be able to do this again. But secondly, to establish a proper framework for media regulation in Venezuela that establishes an independent regulator, and that also, by the way, establishes independent editorial control over the huge number of state channels, both radio and television, that exist in Venezuela. I understand that the channel that basically replaced Radio Caracas on television, remind me, what's it called? Tevez, that's right, is essentially controlled by a board which is appointed by, guess who, Chavez. So it's another state channel. Now, that kind of model we really need to move away from. We need independent regulation. We do not need governmental interference of the kind that we've seen here. I'll just leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much. Richard.
You've got your own mic.
Oh, do I know?
You have your own microphone, I
can
think?
just speak
Yes.
without this machine. Good. That's even better. Well, I just want to make sort of 3 quick points. RCTV had its license withdrawn, and it was immediately replaced by Tevez, which is designed to be a public service broadcasting channel. Now, as you said, it is, of course, initially the directors have been appointed by the government, but in the nature of things, it takes a very long time to set up public service broadcasting, as we know from the experience of the BBC, which anybody who's worked within it knows perfectly well that you're sort of under threat and online every moment of the day. So obviously it will take a long time for Venezuela to establish public service broadcasting. But of course it has been an exciting moment for Latin America, because in lots of countries there is no public service broadcasting whatsoever. It simply doesn't exist. Countries like Ecuador, which has welcomed the establishment of public broadcasting in Venezuela. Paraguay has no public service broadcasting. So this is an important moment for Latin America, where the whole subject of public service broadcasting is for the first time being discussed. Now, I would say personally that I'm really delighted that RCTV has had its license withdrawn. It's been run by a man who's been described by Chavez as a fascist, and I don't think that's necessarily a word that one needs to bandy around, but it is an ultra-right-wing organization that runs the channel, and maybe it would be just fairer just to describe Marcel Granier, the man who owns it, as essentially undemocratic, or if you like, a supporter of Pinochet, because the April 2002 coup-d'etat, which was supported by RCTV and by Marcel Granier, and he was one of the perpetrators of the coup, one of the people deeply implicated in supporting the new regime in April 2002, which was essentially a Pinochet-type regime that closed down the Congress, closed down the Supreme Court, and arrested several deputies, and was generally in the Pinochet line. So that is why it's a good thing that he is no longer in charge of a television station. Now, secondly, I don't think that closing down RCTV is anything remotely resembling a threat to freedom of expression. It has meant the expansion of public service broadcasting, and I think that we should note that in the Chavez years, a whole series of new television and radio stations have been set up. There is Tevez, the new one that's just run it, and it's being run, I have to say, by an Afro-Venezuelan, the first time that somebody remotely looking black or mestizo has appeared on the screens of a Venezuelan private television channel, now a public one, in the past 53 years since RCTV was set up. Then there is Vive, which is a rather wonderful new innovative cultural station, Telesur, which is trying to do Al Jazeera for Latin America, and 2 or 3 other television stations, then innumerable community radio stations. So you can't really complain that there is no freedom of expression in Venezuela today. And lastly, I just want to make the point, since we're in a journalist club, we have to ask ourselves, why is the image of Venezuela so poor in the outside world, particularly in Britain and in America and Europe, and why is it that it gets this appallingly poor coverage? This is a very crucial. Why are the journalists covering Venezuela so lacking in objectivity that they continually pump out either the propaganda of the rather small opposition groups in Venezuela. Never forget that the opposition is rather small. Chavez got over 60% of the vote in democratic election last year, which is quite unusual in most Western democracies. And I would just remind you that in the constitution, the Chavez constitution of Venezuela, put in there by an elected constituent assembly in 1999, Article 58 says that the people have a right to be informed with news that is timely, impartial, and true. Now that is a wonderful thing to have in your constitution, and I don't think anybody in England could admit that, or could even imagine that our coverage of Latin America could possibly be regarded as timely, impartial, or true. This is something that we, the British, don't have. So I would ask you, when discussing Venezuela, to at least look at the beam in our own eye before you look at the mote in the eyes of the Venezuelans. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Well, I suppose we must all be grateful that we don't have media proprietors with extreme right-wing views anywhere near this country either. Jonathan.
It all sounds very wonderful, Richard. What he hasn't told you about is the blonde kickboxer who presents an exercise show on the new channel which has replaced the one whose license has not been renewed, or about the Brazilian puppet shows which are now filling the airwaves. A couple of quotations for you. This was Hugo Chavez on December the 28th last year. There won't be any new concession for that coup-mongering channel that was known as Radio Caracas Television. The channel was warned that it might be closed with that message at a military parade. There was no judicial process. The accusation that members of the channel were involved in the last coup attempt was never followed up with any legal action against executives from the channel. As I say, there was no process of appeal, no procedure for the closure of this channel. The explanation for the closure of the channel was provided in March, in other words 2 months before the channel actually closed or had its license not renewed. It was a rather strange document known as the White Book, in which some of the accusations that government officials had made about what was wrong with the channel weren't actually included in the document. One of the accusations made by government officials was that this channel, RCTV, was pornographic. That did not actually appear in the document justifying the closure. And last year, a rival private TV channel called Globovision was warned in another speech by Hugo Chavez, "Greetings, gentlemen of Globovision, you should watch where you're going." I think essentially what Hugo Chavez is doing is putting private television stations on notice. There is no doubt that they are not balanced, they are not impartial. There is no doubt that they supported the 2002 coup attempt, at least intellectually, if not in practical terms, in terms of the broadcast that they delivered. But 2002 was 2002, this is 2007. Why has Hugo Chavez waited for 5 years before deciding to close this particular channel, when actually other channels were doing a similar, carrying out a similar function, but were not closed? It's true to say there is huge diversity of opinion in Venezuela. There are 99 television channels, 64 of them private, only 7 of them state. As far as I know, there are no channels which have been suspended, no journalists put in prison. We're not talking about a dictatorship. But I think what this whole question of this television channel begs, really, is where is Venezuela heading? How guaranteed is that plurality of opinion? Is Hugo Chavez going to become, in a sense, the head of an elected dictatorship? And I think that's the bigger question we have to ask. I think there's an enormous amount going for Venezuela at the moment, but I think we are right to be extremely concerned about the signal that the closure of this channel sends out.
Thank you very much. Well, Yolanda, we're talking vigorously about your country. I think it's your turn. You're a Venezuelan journalist. What's your view?
Well, the thing, sorry, I've got a strong cold, so I'll try to do my best here. The thing with the media in Venezuela, they've never been good, as it were, as you can say, it's good in a British sense. It's never been good. It hasn't been good during Chavez government. But you can apply the same thing to the private channels and to the state channels. We've never had such a thing as public state television. And it's not because the state doesn't have the resources, because it does. It does have 2 television channels with national coverage. You can see them everywhere in the country. It's not like, you know, the private channels have got all the resources to put an air, a signal, or whatever. And if it's a matter of widening the public service television, you could argue, why don't you first make the state channel, which is Channel 8, a good television public service, instead of you know, opening a new one? Because the thing is, with the television channel, Channel 8, it's always been the instrument of whoever's in power, and it's not different from, the situation is not different under Chavez. It's nothing like that. And even when, you know, he's got these masses of support, if you look at the ratings, the thing is no one watches the TV channel, the state TV channel. Why is that? Something is not providing. That's one thing. The other thing is, if you look again at the reasons why they close RCTV, you can say, well, but weren't them all, I mean, Venezuelan, Televen, and Globovision, and the other national channels doing exactly the same? It's very significant, the fact that he chooses just to close RCTV, which was the only one who had tried to keep his, you know, opposition viewing anchors or so. The other channels, you know, have bent and tried to moderate themselves, and, you know, as it happens, it's always happened. The thing is, you got to understand, this kind of thing has always happened in Venezuela. It's not a new thing. The only problem is now it's more stringent, it's more polarized, and of course it's something to watch out for. But if in the end you don't want to take a position and say the channel was good, the channel was bad, he was right to close it, he wasn't right to close it, the important thing to consider here is you cannot trust Venezuela to have an institution, a judiciary system, to judge this. So what does it tell you? It's like you can make all the judgments you want, but in the end, if you're supposed to have an institution who can judge on the basis of the law if this was right or this was wrong, the thing is you don't have that in Venezuela at the moment. So what can you expect from a, you know, panorama like that?
Thank you very much. I found that an extremely insightful contribution. And it seems to me that there are a number of issues that we're looking at here. This whole discussion in Venezuela and abroad has tended to be couched in terms of approval or disapproval of Chavez, where if you like Chavez, you tend to support his closing down the television station. If you don't like what the television station was doing, you can argue, well, they deserved it, as it were. But the point that you make is that what we as journalists should be trying to do is to encourage a regulation, to encourage an atmosphere, to encourage the structures that make for better journalism, whether you agree or disagree with the point of view. It's a very polarized society, however. Do you think that, can you see any prospects of that?
Really, that's very sad. As a Venezuelan, I can tell you that's very sad, because this polarization, you might have heard, it goes even to the family level, where you have families split up over political issues, which is something that was unseen before Chavez, really. Even in my own family, you know, half my uncles and aunts are on one side and the other half are on the other. It saddens me as a Venezuelan to think that, how do you heal that? It's something that, you know, it's broken now, and I don't see it as it happened. That kind of process happened in Argentina as well. It happened in Chile. Still, you have people in Chile, you know, who call Pinochet granddad or so, and people who say, you know, he was a dictator, whatever he was. And it saddens me to think that we might go down that kind of road. I don't think there is a possibility of it healing in the near future, really. If we go to that polarization, I think it's going to stay like that, really, in the short term. Medium term, even. Don't know long term.
Richard, I just want to put you the point that that Peter made, which is that whether you're a Chavez supporter or not, and I don't think you would dissent from the accusation of being a Chavez supporter, that for any president to have that power is a bad thing. Let me just add one thought to that. If the president of Venezuela were someone of whom you disapproved, would you support his having that power?
That's not a reasonable question.
Why not?
Because I mean, that's a speculative question about somebody who's not around. We're dealing with the concrete and actual figure of Chavez. And contrary to what people think, he's not an authoritarian dictator. He's quite a popular guy who manages to scrape up a huge number of votes. But the fact that he doesn't have thousands of people who are doing his bidding every day of the week. He's like any ruler of a democratic country. He has a whole lot of pressures upon him, and he does his best. And I think what people leave out of the equation is that there are 60 or 70% of the country who are actually want change and want things to happen, and they think after 8 years it's time they happened a bit more quickly. So he's under pressure from within to show results. And I think that's really important. And I think the other thing is we need to say something about the reception that Chavez has in the West. And I think that this is all to do with all sorts of historical reasons. With
just before, I promise I will. However, I have to point out in best news night fashion that you haven't answered the question. Well, the question was, is it a good thing for a president to have the power to effectively to close down a television station?
Well, he doesn't have his power. All he has done, as you know perfectly well, is to close down the license that this television station has.
You can't operate without a license.
Exactly. So that seems to be perfectly reasonable, as everybody knows.
That a president should have that power.
Margaret Thatcher closed down Carlton Television, was it? After Thames Television, after it had shown a film she didn't like about the IRA in Gibraltar. Now, that was perfectly, I mean, people objected. I'm sure a lot of people in this room would have objected, but it was perfectly okay in the system. And I think it's absolutely wrong that we should be pontificating about what sort of journalists and what sort of system they should have in Venezuela, which is a country about which most people, apart from this comrade here, who know very little whatsoever. And I just think it's absolutely arrogant to suggest that you have been doing, that we should be telling them what to do.
Jonathan.
The reason that the government of Venezuela has given for closing the station is quite interesting. This station was founded in the 1950s. It's the most popular television station in Venezuela. It's not just any television station. It's like ITV. The reason it was given...
Not like ITV, that's ridiculous.
It is the largest audience. It's got the largest audience. And the irony is that although Richard in print has described it as a white supremacist channel,
correct,
because it is run by the colonial elite of Venezuela, the irony is it has a huge audience that loves watching Who Wants to Be a Millionaire.
Why is that ironical?
Because, well, the irony is that a lot of the programs and the formats are American television formats, and indeed the formats which have appeared on the channel which has replaced it are American formats. The point I was going to make is that the television license ran for 20 years. That was the rule dating back from the 1980s. So the TV station knew that its days were numbered. It actually applied 5 years ago. It raised the point with the government and said, look, this license is going to be up for renewal. What the television station says is that the government never replied to this request. And although the Venezuelan government says that licenses run for 20 years, why is it that another television station in Venezuela has been given a 5-year license rather than a full 20-year license? Why is it that that license happens to expire just before the end of Chavez's next term in office as president? Is it perhaps because he wishes to apply political pressure to it and say that you won't have another 15-year license to run unless your coverage changes and it is more sympathetic to my government?
Peter, Richard thinks it's arrogant that we should suggest to Venezuelans what kind of journalism they should have, although you were in praise of the notion of public service broadcasting in Venezuela, which is presumably slightly prescriptive about what sort of journalism you'd like to see. But you would like to see, if I remember correctly, a culture which protected journalism, responsible journalism in Venezuela. What is it that Chavez is doing apart from closing down this television station? Do you think that Chavez is moving in that direction, as Richard argues, with setting up a PBS system, or do you think that it's all one way?
No, I don't think he is. I mean, if you look at what he's done over the last couple of years, he's run a regime that has been very hostile to media freedom. There are tens of applications pending at the moment at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, complaining about violations of press freedom. They've just ruled on one from Global Vision, actually, in which they upheld the complaints. He has introduced new legislation in which he has made it a criminal offense to criticize public officials. He's heightened, the kind of penalties that are available for that. And if you look at, just if you don't want to take it from us, Westerners, then take it from the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, which is a regional body that upholds a regional human rights treaty to which Venezuela has signed up, and which has been highly critical of the Venezuelan regime. And Chavez actually, Chavez has been very hostile to that body also. Under Article 13 of that convention, there is a right to freedom of expression in very similar terms to what is laid down in the Venezuelan constitution. But Chavez has effectively, given the commission two fingers up. And that's not the kind of environment in which you can have free journalism, and that's not the kind of environment in which public service broadcasting is going to thrive. I mean, two things. To, first of all, pretend that you can establish public service broadcasting by first shutting down a private station in a complete, fashion that completely ignores the rule of law. Well, that's not going to work. You can't establish something good on the basis of an act like that. Secondly, to compare or to somehow justify what Chavez has done by referring to another act of censorship, but this time by Maggie Thatcher, that's also not going to fly. You can't justify one act of censorship but by saying, there have been similar acts in the past. Well, they were also wrong. So overall, I would give it a, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd give it a 1. If you want to ask me, how is Chavez moving in terms of protecting press freedom? Well, he isn't.
Well, of course, I disagree with that. I think he's doing an absolutely splendid job by closing down a ultra-rightist television station. Seems to be absolutely justifiable. And if Rupert Murdoch and Conrad Black and the right-wing figures that you, as it were implying were behind the British media, had they been recommending a coup d'etat and participating in it, do you think for a moment that their filthy newspapers and television standards would have been allowed?
But there's a process for that.
5 years on from the coup, because after the coup, Chavez, under huge pressure from the United States and elsewhere, from Jimmy Carter and others, decided to try to make arrangements with the opposition that they would not allow anybody to get into that position of having a coup again. And he completely rolled back, and although there were huge demands for all 4 of the Golpista television stations to be closed down, he said, no, we'll try and reason with them. Then that effort had no success at all. All 4 private television stations reorganized 6 months later to organize a coup d'etat in the petroleum industry, a strike to try and bring the country to its knees, and that was destroyed, as it were, again by the military, who said we're not going to have people interfering with the petroleum industry in this way. And so Chavez did not even begin to move until he was re-elected in one election and then in another, and then he decided to move. And he had also previously made a deal via Jimmy Carter. There's a rather good story in the Herald Trib about it this morning, where he agreed with Gustavo Cisneros, the most powerful, really, of the media barons in Venezuela, and made an agreement that, in fact, that Cisneros' television station would calm down and stop behaving like a political party and behave like a television station and start trying to give impartial news. And that seems to be an excellent way to do things, and shows that Chavez is a pretty reasonable guy and can make friends across the the borders. I just have to say as a footnote that it's absolutely wonderful to think that Marcel Granier, the fascist owner of RCTV, happens to be the brother-in-law of Cisneros. He married their two sisters, married to each other, who inherited the American Phelps fortune in Latin America. So there's a lot of sort of infighting, and so Marcel Granier is now slagging off Cisneros for being nice to Chavez and vice versa. So there's a lot of sort of stuff going on in the background. May I just make my point
your historical point. Yes.
My historical point about the Western, and I have to say the NGO attitude, because I think you represent an NGO that is funded by Western governments. Am I right?
Correct, yeah.
Right. So I'm talking about...
They're the only ones that give us money. I don't see Chavez giving us any money to promote press freedom.
The Western...
I'll ask him if you want.
The Western and the NGO attitude. And
I'll apply tomorrow.
And there are countless NGOs dealing with broadcasting and press freedom in one way or another. And I sometimes wonder whether they shouldn't pay more attention to what goes on back at home rather than trying to change the world. But the big problem about Chavez is, I think, for the sort of intelligentsia, the Western sort of semi-left, is that he's a military man, and all of us remember the military rule in Latin America in the 70s and 80s, and there is something slightly, you know, you have to get your head around it and remember that actually there had in Latin American history been progressive generals and colonels, and even in the case of Sergeant Batista in Cuba, a progressive sergeant, briefly. So that is something people have to get over. And secondly, Chavez is a fantastic champion of anti-globalization. And all of us are told all the time by our media and by our governments that there is no alternative to globalization. You have to accept that this is the modern world. They don't even discuss it. And Chavez says we must discuss it. And thirdly, there is an extraordinary thing about Chavez which is really to do with why he dislikes the United States. Now, in a curious way, most people in most of the world think that the United States is the most dangerous power in the world. It obviously is. It's the most powerful. It's got the most weapons. It's the most dangerous power. Now, on the whole, the West, in Western Europe and doubtless the NGOs, think that somehow or other you should be close to the United States, join them, ally yourself with them, and somehow or other you can persuade them not to be quite so dangerous if you're very close to them. Chavez has a completely opposite idea. He thinks that those people who dislike the United States should get together in an alliance to oppose the United States. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and I wish our own government would do it.
But why is he so hostile to human rights? Why is he so hostile to a human rights body that is established, is made up of his peers, of South American?
A UN human rights body at the UN General Assembly.
It doesn't surprise me Chavez thinks the UN should be closed down.
No, but why is he so? But why is he so hostile to a regional human rights body that he himself has signed up to?
It's run by the Americans.
It's not. No, it's not actually run by the Americans. This is a human rights body that criticizes the US a lot. Why is he so hostile to that? And why is he so hostile to the rule of law in his own country? Why, when there's a ruling against him by a body made up of South American experts on human rights that he violates freedom of expression, why does he give that two fingers up?
Presumably thinks that they're right-wing Latin Americans in the pay of the United States. And
well, they're not. I mean, that's a very cheap way of dismissing it.
No, it's a very, very effective way of the great man.
No, but very cheap and intellectually completely bankrupt, if I may.
It's either the colonialists or it's the Americans. It's either one or the other.
Yes.
And you do reach a point where you have to say that doesn't wash.
Yolanda, the point that that Richard was making about the behaviour of the television stations, I mean, we all know about the coup attempt. It seems to me that one of the, disgraceful that episode was, one of the consequences of the coup attempt is that it has reduced the space for legitimate opposition in Venezuela, because it has become quite easy to associate all opposition with golpismo. Mm-hmm. But given the behaviour of the television stations when Chavez, as Richard described, tried to negotiate with them, is there not a case for saying there's little to be done with these institutions, with these attitudes, we simply have to start again?
You mean like having new channels or something like that? I suppose so. I just don't see how that can happen, really. Indeed, what happened in 2002, it was hopeful. Everybody knows now the media made a big mistake back then. But
Indeed, did a British government minister, I seem to remember.
yes, it was, but it was all the media, you see. It wasn't just RCTV, it was Venevisión, it was Globovisión, it was Televen, it was all the newspapers, all at the, and by the same token, isn't the television, the state television channel committing the same crime, but you know, in the other direction? For instance, you will never see a demonstration by the opposition in the public state channel. And you won't see it nowadays in Venevisión, the channel which is owned by Gustavo Cisneros, just because he made this agreement with Mr. Chavez, because indeed he's a very powerful man. He's the owner, is one of the owners of DirecTV as well, which is a, you know, it's a big international, global company. And the agreement, it's been, you know, you just keep quiet and I'll allow you to do business as you please. You know?
Can I follow up from that
please,
point?
yes.
Is that you can call that impartial? Can you call it a good deal in terms of having good journalism, guaranteeing good journalism from the Venezuelans?
Yeah, the channel that Yolanda's referring to, Venevision, which, as Richard was saying, there's an article about it in today's Herald Tribune, is surviving as a private TV channel, indeed thriving after apparently doing some sort of deal with Mr. Chavez himself, whereby it toned down its criticism of the government. And there was a European Union study last year of the presidential election coverage. And the EU study concluded that the Venevision's coverage really went through a volte-face from having been very critical of Chavez, where it basically reached the conclusion that 84% of the coverage was on Chavez and only 16% was on the opposition candidate, who, it has to be said, only appeared from the woodwork quite late in the day. And I also think it's worth saying, as Yolanda was saying, the problem is there is no Lord Reith in Venezuela. Chavez has made a bad situation worse. He has polarized the media. He has used the state media to make it even more biased than it was in the first place. And I was struck by a very carefully written article in The Guardian, Richard's paper, by their Caracas correspondent a few weeks ago, in which he quite bluntly said, and I quote, "Terrestrial TV is now virtually free of government criticism." And he wrote it very carefully because Venezuela is an extremely sensitive issue. A lot of people want to believe that Mr. Chavez is a very good thing. But I thought that was quite a striking comment to make.
And can I just add, you've got these cases in the past, for instance. Televen had this anchor woman who's called Marta Colomina. She was very critical of Mr. Chavez. She went off air 2 or 3 years ago. Why? Because Mr. Chavez talked to Televen and said, look, if you don't take Marta Colomina off air, we're going to have a problem here. We'll have to discuss this. And Televen took her off air. That happens. It's always happened. I just like to stress, it happened during the Adecos, the Copellanos governments. It's just the thing that now is more polarized and it's more extreme. And also, you know, no one in an Adeco government, which is, you know, the left-wing party that ruled the country alternatively with Copey before Chavez, no one in ADE would have thought of closing down this channel permanently, because historically RCTV has been closed before this time 2 or 3 times, but just temporarily as punishment for particular, you know, pieces of news they put on air that, you know, the government wasn't happy with it, and they decided you're going to pay for this, so I'll close you for 2 or 3 days or a week or whatever. But it was never like in the mind of anybody just to definitely close a channel. And in fact, there is this gossip, it's just gossip as it were, but they say the real reason why the former Vice President José Vicente Rangel left his post was because he was totally opposed to the closing of RCTV. And the gossip also says that the government actually tried to buy RCTV before deciding to close it, but because Marcel Granier said, I'm not going to sell it to you, well, he went on and just closing it down. So it was like, in the beginning, when Chavez said, I'm going to close RCTV, I was in total disbelief. I was like, he's bragging, you know, he's just one of those threats. But he's shown he's prepared to do whatever he needs to do, he feels he needs to do to accomplish his objective, whether they are good or bad. I'll again like to say it's not for me to decide, but the truth is, it's shown that he's prepared to do whatever it is, above any law, above any tribunal, above any institution, which is really the thing that's been lost in Venezuela, the institutionality.
Thank you. Right.
Can I just add one?
Well, I think actually it's probably
footnote.
time to give the audience a turn. Could I ask if you please to identify yourselves, and please, we're interested in questions rather than extended speeches, though perhaps little ones could be tolerated. And if your question's for a particular person, please indicate who it's for. Gentleman in the front row, and wait for the microphone.
Yes, good evening. Thank you. I have a question for the panel, and I have a question for Richard Gott, if I may. The question for the panel is, Eva Gollinger has unearthed a gold mine of public documents through the Freedom of Information Act in the United States. And through that, we know that the principal means that the Americans tried to subvert the Venezuelan government was via the media. So the National Endowment of the Art, the National Endowment of Democracy, which is basically doing the functions that the CIA used to do in the past, is mostly channeling its funds and therefore subversion via the media in Venezuela. So right now, up to this point, you have basically been discussing the media as if it's an internal Venezuelan program or problem, but in reality, it's actually, there is internal or external subversion taking place, and I think that has to be addressed. And allow me a question to Richard Gott. I think there has been some disgraceful reporting in The Guardian, especially by Simon Tisdall, about Venezuela. And my question to you is, it's not only Tisdall, but also in the sister newspaper, The Observer. And I was wondering, internally in The Guardian, what type of discussion takes place? In the sense that if you have a disgraceful article, why does it coexist with what I consider to be very good reporting on your part?
You wouldn't like, for those who may not have read Simon Tisdall's article, what did you find disgraceful about it?
Well, basically demonizing Chavez, and on all accounts, even going to the extent that he's the February article that even went to the extent that Al Qaeda was setting up branches and whatnot. A totally disgraceful article because it has no element in fact in many cases, and basically parroted the American propaganda on Venezuela.
Okay. Who would like to address the American issue first?
I mean, I can kick it off on that. I think that's disgraceful also, but it doesn't justify shutting down, this. But okay, no. But what I'll say is this, and America actually scores very low on the Press Freedom Index also. If you look at, there's an index made by an organization called Freedom House, and Reporters Without Borders are one as well, and America doesn't scrape into the top 50. And this kind of state propaganda is very regrettable, but the problem is, you've got to deal with that within a system of the rule of law. You can't ignore the rule of law and just say, well, we've got some evidence of American interference. Let's take some heavy-handed action and shut down a couple of TV stations here. That's just not the way of dealing with that.
Peter, American interference? Do you feel like?
I think the problem, as I see it, is the use that Chavez makes of the United States, and that however much demonization of Chavez occurs, Chavez is quite happy to demonize the United States, and in fact use it to portray, it's a classic tactic, to portray an external enemy, to make it bigger than it actually is, in order to, as I see it, to enhance his own position within Venezuela. There is a long history of US interference in Latin America, I understand that. It's deep-rooted, the fear is absolutely genuine. Chavez has repeatedly said there have been American attempts to assassinate him. He's never provided any evidence for this whatsoever.
There was a coup.
There was a coup. But he says since then there have been several attempts to assassinate him. What I'm saying is that I think the use that he makes of America, and I don't dispute the history, is not something which is in the end productive. I think there's a war of words on both sides. I don't think America has plans to invade Venezuela, as he keeps telling us that it does. I think if you look at the world stage, you'd say America was rather busy at the moment on other fronts to even consider it. But it's useful domestically.
But of course it's got plans to invade Venezuela.
Invade everywhere,
Exactly.
yes.
It would be foolish if it didn't. But whether it plans to put those plans into operation is the question. But the plans clearly exist because we know about them for every other country in Latin America.
Richard, do you want to address the...
But obviously I will address the question of The Guardian. I'm afraid I left The Guardian like almost a decade ago, so I cannot speak for the current regime, and I am gratefully, with gratitude, allowed to contribute from time to time on a sort of old boy network. But you're absolutely right to say I still think that the demonization of Chavez, which I think is sort of encouraged by organizations of your kind and that of other sort of human rights and NGO organizations who contribute.
You don't like human rights much, do you?
I don't, no. I'm a bit like Goering. When I hear the word human rights, I reach for my machine gun. So
yeah, I get it now.
You can imagine what sort of view I have, because I think that your lot have discredited the notion of human rights by making it so minuscule. I mean, in my youth, human rights meant trying to prevent regimes from torturing people. That seems to be absolutely wonderful and fine, and we should all campaign on behalf of that. But the idea that you tell people, you know, what they should do with their newspapers and their television stations and call that human rights, I think is absolute rubbish.
Correct, and that's what Chavez is doing. He is telling the newspapers and the TV stations what they should be doing.
Yeah, well, it's not your job to be telling Chavez what he should be doing.
Is it yours?
I'm not telling him anything. I'm just trying to be...
Is it your job to tell me what I should be doing?
But let me just say one more thing about demonization. I've been writing about Chavez for jolly nearly 10 years, and his program and his project is incredibly decent and old-fashioned. If those, and not many here can remember, but he's a bit like, you know, Clement Attlee or Franklin D. Roosevelt. He is trying to have a fairly decent regime that introduces a bit of modernization, that tries to be nice to Indians and blacks, that tries to get over the terrible heritage of colonial white settler Latin America. And I think he's a just wonderful guy, and the Venezuelans are unbelievably lucky to have somebody like that. Now, you can't get that into the British press except in the columns of The Guardian from time to time. People just do not subscribe to this idea because the wells are permanently poisoned by guys like you.
Well, I have read it in The Guardian quite a lot, in balance to Simon Tittle. And Yolanda, what do you think that the use of the misuse of American taxpayers' money to influence or to support anti-Chavista media in Venezuela changes the argument materially, as the questioner suggests?
I don't know really, because as a journalist, I must say, I was a journalist for a long time before coming here. I haven't been there for the past 5-6 years, that's true. So I don't know really how the situation has changed in those terms lately. But while I was there, it's very difficult as a journalist to kind of feel the influence of this money coming from, I don't know what kind of idea you have about the way the media really works inside. I know very little about the media here. You know, the BBC is a bit of a bubble, especially the World Service. But there are different levels. For instance, you as a journalist, you can get a direct order to go and cover this story or that order. But it's not like there is, you know, a memorandum or something saying you have to be pro-American or whatever. It's not like that. So it's very difficult, even...
Do you think they're not getting value for money, in other words?
You might say so, I suppose. Yeah, at some point.
Thank you. There was a gentleman there. Could you wait for the microphone, please, and if you care to tell us who you are.
My name's Lee Brown. I'm from the Venezuela Information Centre. Firstly, it's a request to the panellists to use accuracy in their language, because I think that's the only way we can move forward in this debate. RCTV has not been closed down or shut down, has been referred to. Its licence has come to an end and it has not been renewed. It is still free to air on satellite and on cable. And if you're going to say it's
available in 1 and 5,
well, then you could say Sky News has been shut down in this country. So it is still free to air on satellite and on cable. On its licence, the public airways are a public space. Access is regulated, and the only way you can regulate the content and access to them is through democratic governments. And as President Lula in Brazil said, it's just as democratic to allow access to the airways as it is to deny access to the airways. So I think we need to have clarity in this particular debate. My question is to the human rights organisation on the end. Can you say what you have done to investigate the human rights that were violated during the coup against President Chavez in April 2002, the role of the US in that, and the role of the media in that, because several people were killed in that coup, many people were tortured and shot at, as can be seen on the film The Revolution Not Televised, and we're very grateful to know what work you have done to investigate that.
Peter.
Well, like I said, there are many complaints pending at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, many of which have been brought by partner organizations of ours. Does that answer your question? Well, in a rule of law system, when somebody is shot and the attacks are not being investigated, you can take the states to an international human rights court for failing to do that. So that is what happened. I should also remind you that, you know, I may be mistaken here, but it seems to me that Chavez was in power before and after the coup, so it would really be up to him to be investigating human rights abuses in his own country. But, I mean, I don't want to score any cheap points here. I want to engage with the main point that you're making, which is about ownership over the airwaves. And I completely agree with you that the airwaves are a public resource and they should be used for the public benefit. But that does not mean that they should be regulated by the government directly. The government is a political entity. It has political, you know, agendas that it wants to bring to bear on the media, as we can see by what has happened, you know, in the last couple of months here. So what you need, if you want to properly regulate the airways, is you need an independent regulatory body. You don't need a government minister to be in charge of that. We've seen evidence in tens of countries where you have a similar situation, and it is just a recipe for disaster. You get executive interference and you get censorship, and let's not mince our words here. This was censorship. You can make a play with words. You can say, oh, they're allowed to go on cable or on satellite, but the reality is that they've been denied their audience. And the audience have been denied their TV station because not everybody has cable or satellite access over there. So this is really my main point to you. If the Venezuelan government is serious about establishing public service broadcasting, which I would applaud, if they are really serious about regulating the airwaves for the public benefit, then establish a system that withdraws direct government interference from, you know, from that regulation, and that allows for independent regulation in the true public interest and not in the interest of a government.
Robin, you had your hand up. Could you wait for the microphone, please?
Well, I'm interested to see that in the discussion that there's a tendency to return to Richard's point about the novelty and the importance of establishing public service TV and communications in Venezuela, and it's but somehow the implication is that the whole atmosphere is poisoned because we've got a tyrant there who's trampling on people's basic rights, and therefore we can't engage in, I think, this interesting and important discussion about how, you know, positively, how could they improve, or, you know, what would public service TV actually look like in Venezuela. Instead, we're told that lots of acts contrary to the rule of law and discriminatory of individuals have happened. And I just find this very curious. I've only visited Venezuela a couple of times, and only once since Chavez was there 3 years ago. Was in the midst of an attempt by the virtually entire business community to get rid of Chavez. This was a post-coup attempt to get rid of him. And I was struck by his immense sort of tolerance, to be perfectly honest, of a situation where, for example, you know, employees in education, school teachers, were being paid only if they would agree not to teach the children. If they were actually teaching the children, which many teachers were trying to do, then they would not be paid by their employers, and they were being supported by a very vociferous right-wing press that has not been mentioned this evening up till now. I mean, newspapers, including, I'm afraid, Universal, seem to be supporting this business strike against Chavez. I noticed, I was there 2 years after the coup, I mean, had he vindictively imprisoned lots of people because of participation in the coup? No, he hadn't. And you're suggesting it would have been better somehow if he had. I would have thought it's a rather milder, more civilized thing to do, to quite legally, but do correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I think this, you may not like the law, there are lots of laws I don't like, including in this country, but it was quite legal what Chavez did. It was rule of law. And I had a student who spent 3 years investigating, researching educational system in Venezuela, and I said how extraordinary that you can have educational authorities that back attempts to get rid of the government. I mean, is that really, and they're supported by the media and this, that and the other. And she said, oh, well, the reason he can't hit back at that is because of the Supreme Court ruling, and then she took me all the way through how it would have been violating the rule of law for Chavez just to liquidate, for example, or to pronounce dissolved the Caracas Educational Authority that was, as I say, actively obliging teachers not to teach children. So I would just like to, I mean, I would just say, just concluding very quick point is about, and really a question. I mean, this polarization, this demonization of Chavez long preceded this event. He may have been unwise to close down this station, I don't know. People seem, the sorts of people who are attacking him long before that. Where are these violations? I mean, if he is a tyrant, where are these tyrannical acts? Isn't he, in fact, enormously forbearing and tolerant? That's what it seems to me.
Peter, do you...
Jonathan.
I'm so sorry, Jonathan, forgive me.
I take your point, and I take Richard's point, that waiting 5 years before closing down this television station is not a crime. That if he imprisoned people then, that's the point you're making, I'd have been criticising that too. I take that point. But the point is there was no judicial process, there was no review, the appeals of the TV station were ignored. I think what the point I started this discussion with, I'll come back to now. You said, well, where are these violations? I think there is a politicization of so many things going on in Venezuela concurrently. I know we're here to talk about a TV station, but it seems to me you need to see things in the round. There is the question of whether Chavez will change the constitution, which will mean that he will be allowed to run for office as many times as he likes. There'll be no term limit. That decision may be left to a referendum next year. That referendum has apparently been postponed precisely because of the row over this television station. Apparently the Venezuelan government were really surprised at the degree of opposition. There are thousands of students taking to the streets about this issue. Not just private, privileged university students, but public university students too. Another area of concern in terms of the politicization is the armed forces, which are not supposed to be politicized at all. Chavez has issued a decree ordering junior officers to salute their senior officers with the cry of homeland, socialism, or death. And that's how you're supposed to greet your senior officer. Now, if that isn't politicization, I don't know what is. And Chavez's advice to those who don't wish to follow out this command is to leave the armed forces, and indeed some of them have done that. And I think you just have to see the situation around. I really want to believe that Chavez is everything that Richard says he is. Venezuela desperately needs somebody to sort out its huge problems. Politicization of the oil industry, which I could talk about perhaps some other time. It seems to me you can't really talk about Venezuela properly without talking about the oil industry. How these social programs that are undoubtedly helping the poor, how are they being funded? Is it sustainable? Is it purely dependent on the current high oil price? Where is the money coming from? That's how I see this whole issue of the TV station within a much broader issue of whether... I'm not out to get Chavez, I don't want him to fail, I'm not part of the colonialist elite, I'm not supporting the American position, but I don't believe that he is everything that you want him to be.
But what's wonderful about what you just said is why are Western journalists not going out to report and answer all those questions that you've just asked? It'd be wonderful if we had accounts of what was actually going on at the grassroots level, but we don't, because it's filled with all this sort of human rights crap that your guys are speaking in all the time. And if you look, you've only got to look at the coverage and the sort of cutting. It's just absolutely breathtaking. There is never any discussion and analysis of what's actually going on the ground, and I would welcome it.
Views on open democracy, I have to say. I think the lady in the back row was next.
My point has almost been covered already, but I was questioning, Richard said earlier on that he was lauding the kind of the decent and the old-fashioned qualities of Hugo Chavez, which I think in some ways can't be disputed. It's the sustainability that I question to some degree, and we've talked quite a lot about the recent past in 2002. Yolanda pointed out the deep polarisation in the society, and if you go through a process where you do eliminate to some degree political opposition in political institutions, and you go through the politicisation of the military and the oil industry, and eventually media organisations as well, and you don't have an independent and effective judiciary, it isn't a sustainable model. And it doesn't matter how decent it is, it doesn't matter how, in the short term, how many poor people are improving their lives, it isn't sustainable. Plural societies are sustainable. If you take away a plural society, if you politicise every institution and eliminate the opposition effectively, it's not going to last that long. Somehow something's going to happen. Yolanda made the point earlier on that the society is going towards some polarising spiral.
I think history is against you. Non-plural societies are undoubtedly sustainable, as we could give the example of Saddam Hussein. I mean, it's perfectly easy to keep non-plural societies going indefinitely. But you're right to say that we would like to have societies that we can approve of that were plural. But Venezuela is going through the most amazing upheaval of its history. Half the population have not been within civil society or political society at all, ever. And so suddenly you have this vast quantity of people who are sort of, as it were, clamoring, hammering at the doors, and Chavez is, as it were, sort of introducing them to the pleasures of taking part in politics. So of course everything is politicized from the top to the bottom. I mean, the wonderful thing is that, I mean, anybody who's worked as a journalist knows that whatever the rules of the game, you as the journalist know what the rules are and how to manipulate them and how to organize yourself in a country like this or the United States, and it's certainly true in Venezuela as well. It's just that in Venezuela it's more tricky because the customs have been all thrown up into the air and are dropping down all over the place, and nobody knows exactly what's going to happen in the future. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. Chavez doesn't know what's going to happen in the future. All he says is we must educate as many people as we can, particularly of the lower orders, so that they have an opportunity to enter the political process, and we'll see what they demand. But I think we should never forget that the people from below are demanding lots of things all the time, and that often simply doesn't get above the radar in the coverage of the Western press.
Thank you. Was there... Yes. Ms. Hogg.
I have a question for Peter. I was very, this is not an area of expertise, but I was very privileged to attend a meeting in Buenos Aires in May of journalists from all over Latin America, and the theme of the meeting was freedom of expression. It was in fact convened by a former associate of Article 19. And what I drew from that experience, I kept very quiet throughout, but what I drew from that experience is that freedom of expression wasn't a very useful concept for many of the journalists working inside Latin America, certainly many of the alternative media producers working inside Latin America. We've spoken briefly about the need for public service media across Latin America, but what these journalists were saying was that freedom of expression was actually a concept that was used more by global media companies to protect their own interests than it was by the impetus for public service media and what these people who were convened in Buenos Aires were pushing for. And what they would really like is freedom to express, and rather than as radical action that could be taken on behalf of the state to get them that freedom. And so my question for you was, is that something that your organisation can accept and can work with in Latin America? Is the freedom to express and not freedom of expression a concept with which Article 19 deals and which takes seriously in that region?
Thank you.
Can I just clarify? I mean, just hold on to the mic for a second. Are you referring to the difficulty that journalists have, particularly the ones working, well, the difficulties that journalists have expressing their own views, and or are you saying that they're complaining about being oppressed by their editors, basically, and the owners of the outlets that they work for? And so
I don't think they were complaining about being oppressed by their editors. I think there was a general feeling that their own culture wasn't represented by the channels. I'm not sure how many of them were journalists from places like Global Vision. They were more sort of from alternative media sources, and were hoping for a media that could express their own culture.
Yeah. So it's yeah. Okay. So I know what you're talking about. Now we are very concerned about that. We believe in freedom of expression not just as a media right, but actually as a right of everyone and as a right of the public to a pluralistic media scene. It's very hard for us to convince these. I mean, journalists like the ones that you met have these beliefs because of their experiences. They've had very negative experiences. They don't see their own stories reflected in the mainstream media. And that's actually a problem that you don't just see there. It's a problem that you see here as well. I mean, huge parts of the society here are underrepresented in the media. But the way that we try to engage with that is in two ways. We try to educate them in using international mechanisms which can help them actually force the state to do certain things, given, provided that the state is responding to international mechanisms like the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And the second thing we try to do is just to pressure the state to really to start regulating the airwaves in the public interest, which does not mean just selling them off to the highest bidder, but to actually have a concept of pluralism and independence of media outlets and all of that, and to have independent media regulation. And I mean, that's not something that we see on the continent so far. And public service broadcasting isn't something that exists on the continent so far. So we try to engage with these things, but it's an uphill struggle, as it is for the journalists.
Yes.
Oh, it's just 2 points really to the panel. I mean, one is, the idea about private media in the context of it being all democratic and free. Obviously, the definition of private media is that you have to have a considerable amount of money in order to run private companies, etc. So in that sense, it's not exactly the most egalitarian thing, and at least democratic governments are elected. So whatever criticisms people might have, they have gone through some process and are subject to some process of accountability. So if people don't like what they've done in one particular area, they can vote them out of office. And the other thing is, I think you do have to see this in this whole discussion and the people who were protesting or whatever in the context of the whole country and what gains have been made, because at least people can read now and can read the newspapers who couldn't read before. And, so many people were denied access to all of these debates for a whole load of social reasons, and that's changed or is beginning to change now. So I do think it's important to see it in that context.
Thank you. Did you want a response, or you just said something that?
I think it's a very good point, but it links up to what the lady at the back was saying about how sustainable all these improvements are. The interesting thing about these social programs is that they are funded not from the central budget of Venezuela, but from the coffers of the state oil company. It was about $6.9 billion last year. The problem with that is that the social programs that allow people to learn how to read are so closely tied to the price of oil on the international market and how much oil you take out. Oil production in Venezuela has declined by 10% in the last 10 years. The reason that Chavez is able to afford what he's able to afford is because the price is high, and it won't always be high. And I think that's an important issue. Whether throwing money at problems, dare I say it, is going to deliver the kind of results which are sustainable. And it has to be said that there was a considerable increase in the amount of money spent on these social programs in the run-up to the December presidential election.
Can I just say something about sustainability? Because I always think it's really bizarre that journalists go to a country and say, gosh, this doesn't look as though it's going to last. Oh, this tragedy around the corner. And instead of saying what is actually happening, what is happening in terms of the money spent, the money is being spent on crash programs to deal particularly, for example, with kids aged from 16 to 24, to try and get people who've dropped out of school, people in shanty towns, and get them back into education in order to get them into work and into working for the governmental machine. And this seems to be an absolutely wonderful idea. Now, the other thing is about the oil money. Now, everybody says, God, the oil money is going to run out. Do you know what the figures are? Chavez, nothing to do with the increase in the oil price, which of course has been a completely wonderful bonanza, and thanks to George Bush's invasions all over the world, is going to go on for the foreseeable future. So the idea that suddenly the oil price is going to go blah, 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 is very, very improbable. But the point about what Chavez has done, nothing to do with the increase in the oil price. He's insisted that the foreign oil companies should pay vastly increased royalties, and they've all buckled over, with the exception of Exxon, and agreed to do so. As a result, Chavez now gets 1/3 extra revenue every year from the companies, So the money is beyond the dreams of avarice. It's why he's able to do so many things, not just in Venezuela, but all over Latin America as well, plus paying Cuba for the Cuban doctors and all the rest of it. So I think it's very foolish to think that, oh gosh, it's all going to end at a puff of smoke any day soon, because it ain't. It's going to last for a very long time.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there's a question over there, and one next door. The gentleman with the moustache.
Gordon Hutchison. Listening to some of the panelists, I think you get the impression that the media in Venezuela is largely controlled by Chavez and his parties. That's not the case at all. I mean, a report that the Venezuela Information Center brought out recently on RCTV, it's estimated that 95% of the Venezuelan media is in opposition to Chavez. It's important to reality check. There are 5 major television channels which control at least 90% of the television market. This is all sourced, and we can send you copies of this briefing. Also, the radio stations as well. All of the country's 180 newspapers, companies, both regional and national, are in private hands, as are 99% of the radio stations. Again, we have all the figures you can check. What I think Chavez government is trying to do is to genuinely democratize the whole media press situation. And with relation to recent report from the Minister of Telecommunications, Jesse Chacon, he's pointed out that during the Chavez presidency, the number of TV channels has increased from 30 to 78. And the number of FM radio broadcasters from 368 to 617. So I think there's a genuine attempt to broaden and democratize. Okay. Richard referred to this. And I think, again, we've been hearing all the time, RCTV has been closed. It's not. It's just
okay,
it's
well, that point has been made.
I just want to make this point. And
but
also,
it has been made,
yeah,
and
lastly,
we're getting very short of time.
You should watch the Revolution will not be televised.
Thank you very much.
It has very good footage of the role of RCTV, inciting people onto the streets to overthrow the government.
Thank you. The lady next to you wanted to say something, I think. But we are getting quite short of time, and so I would be grateful for...
Well, my point is just very, very short. It's all about democratization of the media. And I would just like to put it in context, and I think it's important that if we look at Venezuela and compare it to its next-door neighbor, Colombia, I'm very interested that, for example, a journalist like Rory Carroll of The Guardian, he can write a 6-page eulogy of Uribe's government and what he's up to, and he hasn't got a good word to say for Chavez. Now, Chavez might be doing lots of things that, various people don't approve of, but I find that sort of juxtaposition absolutely extraordinary, because Uribe changed the constitution to get himself re-elected, and that seems to be perfectly all right for the United States and Britain. So, and also in Colombia, there is only one national newspaper, and it's owned by the family of the vice president. And nobody ever seems to think that's extraordinary. And he also owns the main TV channel as well. Well, I'm just talking about context here.
I understand. I should also say that it's not true that no British journalist ever criticised Uribe.
Oh, absolutely.
Believe me.
Isabel, you do. But I'm just thinking of Rory Carroll, Guardian and all that.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. We're getting very close to the edge here. This gentleman, and then the gentleman by the coat hangers there. This gentleman here.
Just a quick point to the lady producer from Venezuela. This country has a reputation of being a public service broadcaster, especially the BBC, and on the end of this, Channel 4. It's highly contentious. BBC 1, 2, 3, 4. Is it public service? How would that work in Venezuela, do you think? What is a public service TV channel supposed to do in Venezuela?
Okay, before you answer that, Yolanda, I think we'll take can we take the question at the back, and then we'll try and get... You still have one? Yeah. And then we'll try and get through a few.
It's very much related, actually, to that question, really. It's a question, I think, to you, is it Yolanda?
Yes.
As a journalist, whenever somebody says, I'm going to democratise you, it sends a chill down my spine. But I wondered whether you felt that Richard is right, that Venezuela is such a poor, naive little country that it shouldn't be patronised with ideas of human rights and freedom of expression and things like that. Or do you think it might actually be ready for it?
Right. Okay. First question. I mean, in Venezuela, there's been a group of academics who have been arguing for the necessity of a real public television and radio, which hasn't existed in our entire history. We haven't had. I mean, Channel 8 is supposed to be the equivalent to the BBC. I can't start describing how different that is from reality. So yes, we wish we had a public service of some sort, but the reality is we don't have it. That is true. And also, a very small point here, it might give you the impression that RCTV and the other various private channels there, you know, most of their schedule is actually entertainment. Really, RCTV had a news program in the morning, one news program at noon, and one at night. That's it. They did have some contentious anchors in the morning program, and that was it. The rest of it is soap operas. I can tell you can see soap operas in Venezuela from 1 p.m. till 4 p.m. and then from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. You know, you get like 5 different soaps in every different channel. That's the way it is. So it's not really like you have all these channels all the time attacking whoever is in government or opposition. There are mostly entertainment channels. And there are ways and ways of controlling. Among my colleagues at the moment in Venezuela, the discussion of the day is self-censorship. That's what they're talking about. Because, you know, you can say it was legal, whatever, the not renewal of the license of the RCTV, but what's the real impact, you know, among the rest who are left standing? What do they do in the face of it? And the other point was, yeah, I do think, really, I gotta be really personal here. I do think that some of the analyses that are made from outside Venezuela, those for me are the naive ones, really. It's like, you know, you are starting from seeing things from, for instance, from a country where you say the police officers don't have guns, for instance, and you go and tell that to Venezuelan people, they'll go like, what? So what the police force is for, you see? And you are making analysis from a framework of mind where you live in a country where if you fall off a ladder at work, you can sue your employer for that. You'll never have that kind of thing in Venezuela. It's an altogether different reality. You cannot analyze it from a reality of a European country, really. You have to go back historically and see how complex and how different the circumstances and the culture of the people are. So for me, really, I think I am in your line. Some of the analysis you see here and in some of the European press, you just read them and you say, these people were in Venezuela like, what, 2 weeks? They don't understand the first thing about it. It's a very complex situation. You have to take into account many, many, many different factors.
Thank you. One last question.
I am from Venezuela.
Who is from Venezuela?
This gentleman.
Ah, okay.
And this meeting reminded me when I came to London in the 70s. I was an undergraduate at the London School of Economics. Nobody wanted to discuss the problem of the Soviet Union. When I asked my professor, the explanation was very simple. What is happening in the Soviet Union is because the United States wants to change the regime in the Soviet Union. When I was looking at that book, I think we only need to change the title, and will be Joseph Stalin and the Russian Revolution. It's exactly the same thing. When I came back to the London School of Economics 2 years ago, of course my professor was teaching there. Nobody wanted to discuss the problem of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union now, nobody knew about the Soviet Union. What we said in the past, we don't want to remember now. It's like the husband whose wife is having another girlfriend and who doesn't want to discuss that problem. That is what is happening in Venezuela. We think that Venezuela is the Soviet Union of the 50s and the 60s. And that is why Chavez went to the Soviet Union last week and said, oh, I would like to see the Soviet Union back. That's what he said. And that is why I thought that the bribery which the government is using is only in Venezuela. No, here in England, they are bribing as well. Like the London mayor, who got, I don't know, 20, 25 million. I think the money, the Venezuelan money, is running everywhere. You see? And that is the situation. And we look, Venezuela in 3 or 4 years, and then we said, oh, no. Most of the people who are here won't like to discuss Chavez.
So Caracas gold instead of Moscow gold, Richard?
If only. I thought that was a ridiculous intervention, I have to say. I think to compare Chavez with Stalin and the Bolivarian revolution with the Russian Revolution, you just haven't been following events in your own country. You should go back and check it out.
Well, on which note? Thank you very much for being a highly participative and interesting audience, and I'd like you to join me in thanking our highly participative and courageous and excellent speakers. Thank you very much indeed.